You're not resting. You're lying still because effort no longer leads anywhere inside you. There's a quiet moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No breakdown, no tears, just a body that stays horizontal longer than it used to. A mind that keeps postponing the day not because it hates the world, but because the world has stopped responding in a way that feels real. And somewhere in that stillness a word begins to form. Lazy. That word lands heavily for a reason. It doesn't describe behavior. It judges character. It suggests a flaw, not a condition. And once you accept it, everything else rearranges itself around shame. You stop asking what's happening to you and start asking what's wrong with you. But laziness, in the way psychology understands it, is surprisingly quiet. People who are truly disengaged don't argue with themselves. They don't lie awake feeling guilty. They don't replay who they used to be. They simply don't feel compelled. There's no inner friction. Burnout is the opposite. Burnout is friction everywhere. It's wanting to care and finding nothing there. It's remembering a version of yourself who moved toward things with ease and wondering where that person went. It's waking up tired not just in your body but in your sense of direction. Many people experiencing burnout describe it the same way. I'm still doing the things. I'm just not inside them anymore. They show up to work. They answer messages. They smile when required. But internally there's a widening distance between action and presence. Life feels like something being managed, not lived. Research on chronic stress shows that when pressure becomes constant and recovery never fully happens, the nervous system adapts. Not by collapsing all at once, but by dimming. Emotional range narrows. Motivation loses its texture. The world feels flatter, quieter, harder to enter. This isn't a failure of will. It's a protective response. And yet from the outside, it looks indistinguishable from laziness. Fewer plans, less initiative, more time alone, more time in bed. So the label sticks. You start using it yourself. You tell yourself you've changed, that you've become someone weaker, less disciplined, less driven than you used to be. What makes this especially painful is that burnout almost always follows effort. It tends to happen to people who once cared deeply, people who pushed, people who said yes too often, people who believed that if they just gave a little more, things would eventually stabilize, meaning would return, rest would come later. But later never really came. Instead, the system stayed activated, the mind stayed alert, the body stayed braced, and slowly, without anyone noticing, joy stopped arriving. Not sadness, just joy, interest, curiosity. The small internal reward that says this matters. Psychologists have a word for this loss of reward sensitivity. They call it anhedonia. Not an inability to feel happiness in a dramatic sense, but a dulling of pleasure and motivation across daily life. Music doesn't land the same way. Accomplishments feel empty. Even rest doesn't restore you because rest without relief is just another task. Anhedonia doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in. You start canceling things you once looked forward to. You stop initiating conversations. You avoid projects that used to excite you not because they're hard, but because they feel distant, like they belong to someone else. And this is where the confusion deepens. Because you remember being different. You remember waking up with momentum. You remember caring. That memory becomes evidence against you. If I could do it before, why can't I do it now? The only explanation that seems to fit is personal failure. But burnout isn't the absence of strength. It's the cost of using strength without recovery for too long. Clinical models describe burnout as a progression. It doesn't begin with exhaustion. It begins with engagement, with hope, with a sense of purpose. Only later does stress accumulate, then becomes chronic. Then emotional distance sets in. By the time someone starts calling themselves lazy, they're usually several stages deep. The system has already adapted by shutting certain doors. This is why burnout often comes with emotional numbness or depersonalization, a sense of watching your life instead of inhabiting it. Not because you don't care, but because caring started to hurt. The mind learned that staying slightly removed was safer than staying fully present. None of this feels gentle from the inside. It feels like disappearance, like erosion, like you're slowly being edited out of your own life, one small withdrawal at a time. And still the word lazy keeps echoing, from culture, from productivity standards, from internalized voices that equate worth with output. It's a simple explanation for a complex nervous system response. And it's wrong. If you're here listening to this, there's a good chance you're not avoiding effort. You're avoiding the emptiness that effort now leads to. You're not resisting action. You're responding to a system that no longer gives anything back. Burnout doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means caring stopped feeling safe. And until that distinction is understood, the shame will keep masking the real question beneath it. Not why am I so lazy, but what happened that made my inner world go quiet. There's a particular kind of afternoon that feels heavier than it should. The light outside is soft, almost forgiving. Cars pass by with the dull rhythm of a city that hasn't noticed anything is wrong. Somewhere a neighbor is mowing their lawn. Somewhere else a coffee shop is filling with people who still have plans. And you're inside lying on your back staring at a ceiling you've memorized. Your phone is within reach, not lost, not forgotten, just there. You're aware of it the same way you're aware of your own breathing. Passive. Background. It vibrates occasionally, and each time there's a brief flicker of attention followed by nothing. No urgency, no curiosity, just a quiet acknowledgement that something happened somewhere outside of you. This isn't rest. Rest has a softness to it, a sense that you're gathering yourself. This feels more like suspension, like being paused mid-scene while the world keeps playing. You tell yourself you'll get up in 5 minutes, not because you believe it, but because saying it gives structure to the stillness. 5 minutes becomes 10. 10 becomes 30. Time stretches, but it doesn't open. It just accumulates. At some point, a thought slips in. I should be doing something, not something specific, just something that would justify existing in this moment. That thought doesn't motivate you. It weighs you down. You try to remember when this started. There's no clear beginning, no single breaking point, just a gradual shift. You used to wake up with a sense of direction even if you were tired. Now you wake up tired and directionless, and the tiredness feels secondary. You think about the version of yourself who used to move faster, who answered emails quickly, who took on extra responsibility without being asked. That person feels distant now. Not gone, just inaccessible. Like someone you used to know well but haven't spoken to in years. Sometimes you wonder if everyone else is just better at pushing through. Maybe they're tired too, but they don't stop. Maybe they don't lie here questioning their own wiring. Maybe they don't need to talk themselves into basic tasks. This comparison is quiet but relentless. It doesn't shout, it whispers. What happened to you? Outside, the day continues. Inside, there's a strange stillness punctuated by small waves of guilt. You're not panicking. You're not crying. You're just absent. And that absence feels harder to explain than pain ever was. When you do get up, it's often not because you feel ready. It's because staying still starts to feel unbearable in a different way. You move through the house slowly, touching familiar objects like you're confirming they're real. The coffee maker, the sink, the window. Everything works. You're the only thing that feels delayed. There's a moment standing in the kitchen where you catch your reflection. You look fine, maybe a little tired. Nothing alarming. No visible sign that something fundamental has shifted. And that's part of the problem. There's no evidence. No permission to take this seriously. So you tell yourself a story that fits the surface. I've been lazy lately. It's simple. It's culturally acceptable. It explains why your life has narrowed. But even as you say it, something inside you resists. Because laziness doesn't feel like grief. And this does. A quiet grief, not for something that happened, but for something that faded. You miss the feeling of being pulled toward things. The subtle excitement of anticipation. The sense that effort led somewhere warm. Now effort feels like walking into fog. You can do it. You just don't know why you would. At night, this fog thickens. You scroll without absorbing. Watch without interest. You're not looking for pleasure. You're looking for distraction from the sense that you're wasting time even though you don't know what you're supposed to be doing instead. And occasionally when the house is silent and the world feels far away, a more honest question surfaces. Not what's wrong with me, but what did I give too much of for too long without getting anything back? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, but it changes the shape of the room. The stillness feels less like a personal defect and more like a message that hasn't been translated yet. You lie back down not because you're done trying, but because trying has stopped speaking your language. And in that quiet, the problem reveals itself not as a lack of effort, but as a loss of signal. A life where the internal feedback loop has gone silent, where the world still moves but no longer reaches you. To understand why this state feels so confusing, you have to look beneath behavior and into the system that gives behavior meaning. Motivation, despite how we talk about it culturally, is not a moral quality. It's not something you summon by wanting badly enough. In the brain, motivation is a signal. And like all signals, it depends on circuitry, chemistry, and learning. Much of what we call motivation is regulated by the brain's reward system, a network involving dopamine pathways that connect areas responsible for anticipation, effort, and perceived value. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure, but many neuroscientists describe it more accurately as the chemical of expectation. It answers a very specific question: is this worth moving toward? When dopamine fires appropriately, effort feels justified. Not easy, but meaningful. You feel pulled forward even when a task is hard. There's a subtle internal promise that something on the other side of effort will register emotionally. Burnout disrupts this promise. Under prolonged stress, especially when stress is paired with high responsibility and low emotional reward, the brain begins to adapt. Stress hormones like cortisol stay elevated longer than they're designed to. Over time, this changes how reward circuits respond. Research shows that chronic stress can blunt dopamine signaling, making previously rewarding activities feel neutral or even draining. This isn't the brain malfunctioning, it's the brain learning. From a nervous system perspective, burnout often follows a repeated pattern: effort without relief, responsibility without safety, engagement without restoration. When the brain predicts that effort will lead to depletion rather than reward, it starts to conserve energy. Not by shutting the body down completely, but by reducing motivational output. This is why people in burnout often say, "I can still do things, I just can't start them." Initiation requires dopamine. Maintenance can run on habit. So you might keep showing up but feel increasingly hollow while doing so. There's also the role of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. Under chronic stress, the amygdala becomes more sensitive. It starts interpreting neutral demands as potential threats. Emails feel heavier. Social interactions feel costly. Decisions feel overwhelming, not because they're complex, but because the system evaluating them is already overloaded. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the area involved in planning, perspective, and emotional regulation, gets less support. Stress diverts resources away from long-term thinking and toward short-term survival. This makes it harder to generate motivation through logic or self-talk. You can tell yourself what you should do all day long and nothing moves because the circuitry that translates intention into action is exhausted. This is an important distinction. Laziness implies a functioning reward system choosing not to engage. Burnout is a reward system that has learned disengagement as protection. Neuroscience also helps explain the emotional numbness that often accompanies burnout. When the brain is overwhelmed, it doesn't just dampen negative emotion, it dampens intensity across the board. This is sometimes called affective flattening. The volume knob on experience gets turned down. From the outside, this can look like calm. Inside, it feels like distance. Music doesn't reach you the same way because the auditory and emotional centers aren't synchronizing like they used to. Achievements feel empty because the reward signal doesn't spike. Rest doesn't restore because the system never fully exits a low-grade threat state. Even pleasure can feel tiring because it requires engagement the nervous system no longer trusts. Another piece often overlooked is learning history. The brain is constantly updating predictions based on past outcomes. If you spent months or years pushing yourself while ignoring fatigue, minimizing emotional needs, or tying your worth to performance, the brain learned that effort equals danger. Not dramatic danger, subtle danger, the kind that accumulates. So when you try to push through now, your system resists, not out of defiance, but out of memory. This is why advice that focuses solely on discipline often backfires for people in burnout. It treats a nervous system adaptation as a character flaw. It adds pressure to a system already signaling overload, and pressure in this context doesn't create motivation, it deepens shutdown. Neuroscience doesn't excuse everything, but it reframes what's happening. It tells a different story about why getting out of bed feels harder, why joy feels inaccessible, why effort feels pointless. It suggests that the problem isn't that you've lost your work ethic, it's that your brain no longer associates effort with safety or reward. And that association matters more than willpower ever could. When people say, "I don't know what's wrong with me," what they're often noticing is a mismatch between intention and signal. The desire to care is still there. The capacity to feel the pull of caring is not. Burnout lives in that gap. Understanding this doesn't instantly restore motivation, but it does something quieter and more important. It removes moral judgment from a biological process. It allows you to see your stillness not as failure, but as feedback. The nervous system doesn't speak in words. It speaks in energy, emotion, and avoidance. And right now, it's saying something very specific. I learned that staying engaged was not safe, so I stopped reaching. Once you understand the nervous system side of burnout, another layer comes into focus, one that has less to do with chemistry and more to do with identity. Burnout doesn't just exhaust you, it quietly rearranges how you see yourself. In psychology, identity is not a fixed trait. It's a pattern built from repeated experiences of agency, reward, and recognition. You learn who you are by noticing what happens when you act. When effort leads to meaning, identity stabilizes. When effort leads to emptiness, identity erodes. This is why burnout often carries a strange sense of self-alienation. People don't just say, "I'm tired." They say, "I don't feel like myself anymore." From a clinical perspective, this isn't surprising. Many models of burnout describe a process of depersonalization, a state where a person becomes emotionally distant from their own actions and experiences. You still perform your roles, but you no longer feel anchored in them. You're present, but not embodied. Think about how often people in burnout describe their lives using external language. "I'm going through the motions. I'm on autopilot. I feel like I'm watching myself." These aren't metaphors chosen at random. They reflect a real psychological split between the observing self and the experiencing self. When emotional engagement becomes costly, the mind steps back. It creates distance, not to punish you, but to preserve you. Attachment theory helps explain why this distance can feel especially painful. Humans are wired to seek connection not just with others, but with their own internal states. When you lose access to your feelings, you lose a primary source of guidance. Decisions become harder. Preferences blur. Even rest feels confusing because you no longer trust your internal signals. This is where shame often enters. Cognitive models show that when people can't explain a change in functioning, they default to character-based explanations. Instead of asking, "What conditions led to this?" they ask, "What's wrong with me?" Laziness becomes a convenient label because it feels definitive. It closes the question. But shame doesn't motivate repair. It narrows attention. It keeps the nervous system in a defensive posture. And over time, it reinforces the very shutdown it's trying to correct. There's also grief here, a quiet one. Burnout involves grieving a version of yourself that no longer seems accessible. The energetic self, the curious self, the one who could move toward life without calculating the cost. This grief often goes unrecognized because nothing obvious was lost. No single event, no clear ending, just a gradual fading. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as ambiguous loss grief without closure. You don't know what you're mourning exactly. You just know something essential has changed. And because that grief isn't acknowledged, it turns inward, into self-criticism, into impatience, into the belief that you should be able to snap out of it. But recovery doesn't begin with snapping. It begins with recognition. Many people in burnout are still highly conscientious. They still care deeply about doing things well. That care doesn't disappear. It just loses its pathway. Without emotional reward, conscientiousness turns against the self. Every unfinished task becomes evidence. Every slow morning becomes a verdict. This creates a feedback loop. Low reward leads to reduced engagement. Reduced engagement leads to shame. Shame increases stress. Stress further blunts reward. From the outside, it looks like decline. From the inside, it feels like being trapped in a system you didn't choose. One of the most damaging myths about burnout is that it means you've reached your limit. In reality, it often means you exceeded your limit long ago and kept going anyway. The system adapted the only way it could. Psychological resilience isn't about endless output, it's about flexibility. The ability to move between effort and rest, engagement and withdrawal. Burnout happens when withdrawal becomes the only safe option left. So when you find yourself avoiding tasks, lying still, disengaging, it's worth asking a different question. Not, "Why am I so unmotivated?" But what did my system learn that made disengagement feel safer than participation? That question doesn't excuse everything, but it reframes the behavior as communication, not failure. Burnout isn't laziness hiding in plain sight. It's a protective pattern that outlived the environment it formed in. And until that pattern is understood, not judged, it will continue to shape your life from the background. There's a moment in burnout that almost no one talks about. It happens quietly without ceremony. You stop asking what you want. Not because you don't have preferences anymore, but because wanting started to feel unreliable, disappointing. You learned slowly that desire didn't lead to fulfillment. That anticipation often ended in depletion. So the mind adjusted. It stopped reaching forward. It flattened the horizon. This is the part of burnout that gets mislabeled as apathy. But apathy suggests indifference. And what I've seen again and again is not indifference, but disappointment that hasn't found language yet. Burnout doesn't empty you. It makes you careful. Careful with hope. Careful with excitement. Careful with commitment. Because every time you cared deeply before there was a cost that went unpaid. And eventually the system decided it could no longer afford that debt. Here's the insight that changes how everything else makes sense. Burnout is not the absence of motivation. It's the absence of trust. Trust that effort will be met. Trust that engagement won't lead to collapse. Trust that your inner resources will be replenished instead of drained. From a psychological standpoint, this aligns with what many clinical models describe as learned withdrawal. When the environment repeatedly fails to respond to effort with safety or meaning, withdrawal becomes adaptive. Not dramatic withdrawal, subtle withdrawal. You don't leave your life, you just stop leaning into it. And this is why people in burnout often feel hollow rather than sad. Sadness still assumes connection. Hollow means the connection was severed long enough that the system stopped trying to feel it. There's a metaphor I return to often when I think about burnout. Imagine a house with all the lights on. From the outside, everything looks fine, warm, functional, occupied, but when you step inside, there's no one there. No voice, no movement, just the hum of electricity keeping things running. High-functioning burnout looks exactly like that. You can still perform, still respond, still meet expectations. But internally, the self that experiences meaning has stepped away. Not permanently, just long enough to stop being hurt. This is also where the misunderstanding around laziness becomes especially cruel. Because laziness assumes a choice. It assumes access to motivation that's being refused. Burnout assumes something else entirely. It assumes that access itself has been interrupted. You're not withholding effort, you're disconnected from the signal that tells effort where to go. Many people try to solve burnout by pushing harder, by forcing structure, by reintroducing discipline. Sometimes that works briefly, but often it deepens the divide. Because discipline without trust feels like coercion, and the nervous system responds to coercion the same way it responds to threat. What actually begins to shift burnout is not pressure, but permission. Permission to stop framing your state as a personal defect. Permission to see numbness as a strategy that once kept you functioning. Permission to acknowledge that something important was missing long before you stopped trying. This isn't about giving up responsibility. It's about restoring relationship. Relationship with effort, with rest, with your own internal signals. Burnout resolves not when motivation is demanded, but when safety is reintroduced. When the system starts to believe slowly that engagement won't cost more than it gives. And that belief can't be argued into existence. It has to be experienced. So if you've been calling yourself lazy, ask a quieter question instead. What did my system learn that made stillness feel safer than movement? That question doesn't accuse, it listens. And sometimes being listened to is the first thing that brings the signal back. When burnout settles in, it rarely arrives alone. It brings companions, ideas, and experiences that deepen the sense of confusion. One of the most misunderstood among them is anhedonia. In popular language, anhedonia is often reduced to not feeling happy. But in psychological research, it's something more precise and more unsettling. Anhedonia is the loss of the brain's ability to register reward, not just pleasure, but meaningful feedback. The sense that something you do matters internally. This is why people in burnout often say, even when something good happens, I don't feel it. Promotions feel flat. Compliments slide off. Time off doesn't restore. The system receives information, but it doesn't translate into experience. Neuroscience offers one explanation. When dopamine signaling is blunted by prolonged stress, the brain's prediction system changes. It stops expecting reward. And when reward isn't expected, the emotional response doesn't arrive. This doesn't mean joy is gone forever. It means the pathway to joy has gone quiet. Psychologically, this creates a subtle but powerful shift. You stop organizing your life around what you enjoy and start organizing it around what you can tolerate. This is where burnout begins to resemble depression, even when it isn't clinical depression. The overlap is real, but there's a difference worth noting. In many burnout cases, the emotional shutdown is context-dependent. It developed in response to sustained pressure, not as a global collapse of mood. From an attachment perspective, burnout can also be understood as a rupture in the relationship with the self. Just as children withdraw when caregivers are inconsistent or overwhelming adults withdraw internally when their own needs are repeatedly ignored. The mind learns not to signal desire because signaling hasn't led to care. This helps explain why people in burnout often feel uncomfortable when asked what they want. The question itself feels foreign, unsafe. Wanting implies reaching, and reaching has been associated with loss. Over time, this withdrawal becomes habitual. The nervous system defaults to low engagement because it predicts that engagement will cost too much. Even neutral situations start to feel draining because the system is operating from scarcity. There's also a cultural layer to this. Many American work environments reward endurance over regulation. Pushing through is praised. Rest is postponed. Emotional signals are treated as obstacles. In that context, burnout isn't an anomaly. It's a predictable outcome. What makes MindRabbit's lens different is that it doesn't treat burnout as an individual weakness in an otherwise healthy system. It treats burnout as a mismatch between human biology and modern demands. A nervous system shaped for cycles of effort and recovery placed in environments that rarely allow either. This is why simply removing stressors doesn't always fix burnout. You can take time off and still feel numb, because the system hasn't relearned trust yet. It hasn't received enough consistent evidence that engagement will be met with care, boundaries, and rest. Anhedonia, in this sense, isn't the enemy. It's a signpost. It tells you that the internal economy of effort and reward has collapsed, that you've been spending more than you've been receiving emotionally for a long time. Understanding this reframes the question of recovery. It's no longer about forcing yourself to feel again. It's about rebuilding the conditions under which feeling becomes safe. That takes time, and it takes a different relationship with productivity, worth, and identity, one that allows you to exist without constantly proving value. Burnout isn't just about being tired. It's about living in a world where your nervous system learned that staying open was too expensive. And anhedonia is the quiet record of that lesson. Recovery from burnout doesn't begin the way most people expect. It doesn't start with motivation returning. It doesn't start with clarity. And it almost never starts with energy. Those are late-stage signs. What begins first is something much quieter and often overlooked: a shift in how you interpret your own stillness. According to many models in clinical psychology, nervous systems recover not through force, but through repeated experiences of safety. Safety isn't just the absence of threat. It's the presence of permission. Permission to slow down without being punished. Permission to exist without immediately producing something measurable. For someone in burnout, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. You've likely been trained by culture, by work, by survival to equate rest with risk. To believe that slowing down means falling behind. So even when the body stops, the mind keeps pushing. Judgment fills the space where recovery could have begun. This is why gentle guidance matters. Research on stress recovery shows that the nervous system recalibrates through predictability and containment. Small rhythms. Repeated signals that say nothing bad happens when I don't perform right now. This isn't indulgence, it's retraining. For example, instead of asking yourself to be productive again, you might notice what happens when you complete a task without optimizing it, when you stop it enough, when you let something be unfinished and discover that the world doesn't collapse. These moments seem insignificant, but to a system conditioned by burnout, they are corrective experiences. Another important element is reconnecting with the body, not to push it, but to listen. Trauma-informed psychology emphasizes that burnout often disconnects people from internal cues. Hunger, fatigue, interest, even discomfort become muted. Relearning how to notice these signals without immediately overriding them is part of recovery. This doesn't mean withdrawing from responsibility indefinitely. It means restoring choice. Burnout takes choice away by narrowing options to endurance or collapse. Recovery reintroduces flexibility. You begin to sense when effort is possible and when rest is necessary without moralizing either. There's also a relational aspect. Studies on burnout consistently highlight the role of isolation, not just physical isolation, but emotional invisibility. Feeling unseen amplifies shutdown. Being understood even quietly begins to reverse it. This is why language matters. When you can name what's happening without judgment, the system relaxes. It no longer has to defend itself against misunderstanding. One of the most important shifts happens when you stop trying to get back to who you were. That version of you existed under conditions that eventually broke you. Recovery isn't about returning. It's about integrating. Taking the capacity you had for effort and pairing it with boundaries you didn't have before. Many people fear that if they stop pushing, they'll never start again. But neuroscience suggests the opposite. When pressure decreases and safety increases, motivation often returns on its own, not as urgency, as curiosity, as a gentle pull rather than a demand. This is where the idea of discipline gets redefined. Discipline in recovery isn't forcing output. It's consistently choosing conditions that don't recreate the collapse. It's saying no sooner, resting earlier, listening longer. None of this is a prescription, and it's not a substitute for professional care when needed. It's a reframing, an invitation to see recovery not as something you do to yourself, but something you allow. Burnout didn't happen because you were weak. It happened because you were adaptive in an environment that required too much for too long. Gentle recovery is the process of teaching your system that adaptation no longer has to mean disappearance. There's a moment that often arrives quietly long after the worst of burnout has passed. You're doing something ordinary, washing a mug, sitting in traffic, standing in line at a grocery store, and for a second you notice that you're here, not dissociating, not bracing, not rehearsing the next obligation in your head. The moment doesn't feel joyful, it isn't dramatic, but it's different. According to cognitive psychology, awareness returns before pleasure does. Presence precedes motivation, and that small, almost unremarkable sense of being inside your own life again is often the first true sign that the system is thawing. Burnout teaches you to leave yourself, to function without inhabiting, to perform from a distance. Recovery doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It shows up as subtle re-entry. Many people miss this because they're still waiting to feel like their old self, still scanning for excitement, ambition, hunger. But what returns first isn't drive, it's sensitivity, the ability to feel tired and respond, to feel disinterested and not panic, to feel neutral and let it be neutral. This is why so many people say I'm better, but I don't feel inspired. They assume something is still wrong. But from a nervous system perspective, this is often a healthy plateau, a place where urgency has softened but meaning hasn't reassembled yet. Psychology calls this a liminal state, a threshold. Not the collapse, not the renewal, just the in-between. And culturally, we're very bad at honoring it. We rush people through thresholds. We treat neutrality as failure. We confuse quiet with emptiness. But emptiness and quiet are not the same. Emptiness is absence without permission. Quiet is space with safety. If you've lived in burnout long enough, quiet can feel threatening. When the noise stops, unresolved questions surface. Who am I if I'm not producing? What do I want if no one is demanding it? What matters when urgency is gone? These questions don't need answers right away. In fact, forcing answers too early often recreates the very pressure that caused shutdown in the first place. Research on meaning-making suggests that purpose often emerges indirectly, not through searching, but through noticing. You begin to pay attention to what doesn't drain you, to moments that don't require armor, to conversations where you don't feel smaller afterward. This is not the dramatic rediscovery of passion that self-help culture promises. It's quieter, more fragile, and more honest. You might notice that you no longer tolerate certain environments, that what once felt normal now feels abrasive. That's not regression, that's discernment returning. Burnout numbs discernment, recovery sharpens it, and with that sharpness comes grief. Grief for how long you endured, for how much of yourself went unprotected, for the parts of you that learned survival at the cost of aliveness. This grief is not a setback, it's evidence that you can feel again. Many people try to bypass this stage. They want to be grateful, optimistic, forward-looking. But unprocessed grief has a way of hardening into future burnout. Letting yourself acknowledge loss without dramatizing it, without turning it into identity, is part of closing the cycle. There is no final version of you waiting on the other side of recovery. No permanently balanced self. What exists instead is a relationship, an ongoing dialogue between your limits and your desires. Burnout happened when that dialogue broke down. Healing happens when listening becomes mutual again. So if you're here still tired, still unsure, still quieter than you used to be, there may be nothing wrong with you. You may simply be in a phase that our culture doesn't know how to name. A phase where you are no longer abandoning yourself, but not yet demanding anything from yourself either. And in that space, unremarkable, unspectacular, and deeply human, something sustainable begins to form. Not urgency, not pressure, just a life that doesn't require you to disappear in order to function.